Hello everybody, welcome to our second to last unit. We just have abnormal psych and social psych left. But like I said today in class, this is going to make up a good portion of our AP test, so it'll be fresh in our brains going in. All right, so abnormal psychology is going to be broken into a couple parts. Here's a unit overview, kind of what we'll be looking at over the next couple days. So first of all, today we're just going to talk about the perspectives on psychological disorders, a little bit about the history, the rates, how we classify, and how things have changed over time. But then the other lectures are going to be broken up into these. So we'll talk about different anxiety disorders, somatoform, dissociative, mood, schizophrenia, personality, and then we talked a little bit about why this is called going back to abnormal psychology. It just means that we're looking at things that don't happen as often. So it's completely normal, right, to be sad sometimes, to be anxious sometimes, to have these, different kind of phases. But we're looking at what happens when those things persist over time, right? So this doesn't affect a huge percentage of our population, which is why it's called like abnormal, right? So they're very common among our society, but we're looking at, 90% of psychology, the other things we've talked about, like development, the history, the biological, right? So those things are they happen to, right, 95% of the population. So we're talking to that small population that are affected by these disorders, okay? So some things you should know by the end of lecture. So how exactly do we define a psychological disorder? How do we understand them, and how should we classify them? These are things that have changed over time, and are some of them, especially the classification, are a little up for debate. And then this one, how should we understand, looking at the nature versus nurture? You should know by now the nature versus nurture is going to be in all of the things. All right. Okay, so first let's talk about how our perspectives on psychological disorders have changed over time. And how we define those, right? So how we define a psychological disorder is a couple different things, right? So psychological disorder is marked by deviant behavior. So deviant means like deviating from the norm. I know sometimes the word deviant you think might be a negative thing or like a behavior, but it just means like if here's the norm, it deviates from what we consider normal behavior. Distressful behavior. So sometimes like deviant behavior might be causing harm to other people in our environment, but distressful behavior can be just to ourselves, right? So it's not affecting those around us, but is distressful to ourselves, or what we consider harmful, significant dysfunctional behavior. So we'll look at the DSM-5 and how we classify, but one of the major components is that there is significant harm to our everyday lives, right? So you might have a fear of spiders, right? A phobia of spiders, but if that is not changing, like you're not having significant dysfunction on a daily basis, it wouldn't necessarily be defined as a psychological disorder. So psychological disorders: deviant, distressful, and then harmful or significant dysfunction. You can remember those D's: deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional. Right? This definition definitely varies by context and culture. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but like in schizophrenia, for example, like let's see, people that could talk to the gods or hear the voices or see the visions of the future were actually considered like the tribal leaders. They're the ones that were closest to God. They were on like a different level. However, in our culture and context, if someone said that they could see things and hear things and talk to the gods, that might not be considered as normal, right? So it can definitely change depending on where we are in the world, our context and culture. One of those, another examples, we talked about schizophrenia, but is ADHD or ADD. Some things have changed, but looking at the attention deficit hyperactive disorder is not something that's up for, up for debate, right? It's something it's a psychological disorder. However, where you are might expose that disorder more often. So for example, with a lot of kids, they get diagnosed with ADHD but when they get to go and have to go to a classroom and be still and not, shout out and like control your body, right? So it might not be noticed at all while they're playing in the playground and, out and this and that. But when they have to be in a certain context, right? The context and culture, that is exposed more. And in that situation is dysfunctional. It's distressful to them, right? Not being able to control. However, many, adults with ADHD, they go off and they find careers and things that they do, and they don't have to sit down to that. So, right, that psychological disorder is no longer distressful or harmful to them, even though they still have that diagnosis as ADHD. All right, little bit of history. So psychological disorders have changed a lot over times. In the in the medieval times, people that were acting odd or seeing or hearing things or anxious, they might have thought to have been possessed by the devil. Dark forces, mad people were locked away in zoos. There's still some mistreatment of psychological disorders worldwide, but we're talking about like long ago in history, these things were outside forces. Took a history of medical, biology, medicals, when I would say like practices, and like in the 1600s, people that were sick or acting odd, they thought like it was in their blood, so they would cut them and like try and bleed out all the bad forces, right? So a lot has changed, right? So now we're going on to the medical model. Philippe Pinel, I don't know, he's a French doctor who in the 1700s, 1800s, you might need to know this name, really brought forth like the medical model and changing the treatment of people with psychological disorders, they needed more nurture. They needed hospitalization help versus being putting away in an asylum, looking at mental health as more of a biological problem, medical model, right? So the medical model of psychological disorders just says that there is something wrong like in the brain, whether we know now more like neurotransmitters or parts of the brain, but there's something more medical about it versus the outside forces. This is where we currently are with psychological disorders, and you've probably seen a lot with the mental health movement and really like normalizing mental health and how important it is to ourselves, but also like the treatment of it in different ways we go about viewing. Okay. All right. So we have, you should be just sick of the biopsychosocial chart by now, but just know that psychological disorders, and I'll have this at the end, like in the middle, right? That it's influenced by a ton of different things, right? If we want to look at it from the biology, I know I have this chart later, so I'll just talk about this quickly. The biology, right? We're talking about our DNA, our genetics, the nurture. We can talk about like poverty, where we live, and then our culture, right? So different cultures have different ways they approach mental health. There are some cultures that are not okay talking about it, or that don't believe, right, in mental health. You might have family members that go down this line too. But really when we look at rates and disorders and the way we talk about these things, like different cultures might have different names for these things. So like the underlying cause might be anxiety. We call it anxiety. In Spain, like it's called something different. In France, it's called something different in those cultures growing up. But worldwide, we do see, we see different rates of those things. But worldwide, the two like agreed upon psychological disorders that are seen worldwide, all cultures, all populations, are depression and schizophrenia. So we'll have like separate lectures on those. So some of the ones around anxiety and eating disorders and hoarding and things tend to be specific to cultures, but depression and schizophrenia are worldwide accepted as as psychological disorders. Okay, so how we go about classifying psychological disorders, the DSM-5, you will need to know some information about the DSM-5 and how it's changed over time, and a little bit about its criticisms, all right? So the DSM-5 is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So DSM, we are on the 5th version of this because it's been redone a couple times. And the intent of the DSM-5 is to not only describe the psychological disorder, but also, I'm down here, to predict how that disorder might affect the person in the future, to imply treatments, and to stimulate research, right? To get research going for those things. For example, we'll talk about someone's added, but like what would be, you might think like, what is the intention of adding, like hoarding, right, to the DSM-5, or binge eating disorder. So there's, binge and purge, talking about bulimia, but like binge eating disorder has been added without the purging afterwards. So why add that to to the psychological or to the DSM-5 is not only to predict, to describe, but also to show different types of treatment and then the research around it, right? If it's in there and it's a diagnosis, we're going to get more people researching it. Some criticisms of the DSM, and we'll go a little bit into labeling, is just like, why are we modifying these things? Why are we adding them? Let's keep them broad and general and talk about them like just as anxiety disorders and not the specifics underneath. And then we'll talk about, I actually have in the next slide, looking at like labeling, what the criticism of labeling a psychological disorder. Okay. Well, do I have that? I do. So I'm talking about this first. So the criticism of the DSM-5 and just about talking about psychological disorders in general is that, and we'll talk in social psychology, when we label something, the power of labels can change how we can change and alter how we see other people and even ourselves, right? So Rosenhan's study, oh gosh, I didn't put a picture in there, but basically Rosenhan was put to like a picture of, a person up, and they were talking about like, was this the prison guard or was this the prisoners, right? So looking at if we labeled them as the prisoners, people were more likely to see those people as they looked sad, they looked, harmful, they looked deviant. And then the same exact picture that was labeled the prison guards were described in different ways, right? And so the power of labeling someone as insane or mad or, even people for self-diagnosis that I have anxiety or I have depression can change how you view certain things in your life. Right? The insanity label is changed. This is actually not a medical term. This is actually the law. This is having to do with the law. So saying that someone is insane is actually under the law. It's not medical, but it can change how they are, what's I'm going to say? The way they are prosecuted. Oh my gosh, I had to rewind and go back. The way they are prosecuted or what happens to them after they are given the guilty sentence, right? Do they go to an insane asylum and get medical treatment, or do they go to prison, right? And then the self-fulfilling prophecy, saying, knowing that that you have anxiety or depression, like in having something happen, right? Then you're more likely to act in that way, or know that something might upset you, or be anxious about something, even though it might not. Okay, I'm going to go back here, criticisms of the DSM-5. Okay, so things that have changed over time with the DSM-5. So some big ones that you should know about. So autism and Asperger's used to be separate diagnoses. I told you about this. I have a brother who was diagnosed with autism, and then my other brother was diagnosed with Asperger's syndromes. And then about, I want to say 7-8 years ago, I'd have to look it up, they got rid of Asperger's, and now they call it the autism spectrum disorder. So along the autism spectrum disorder. So Taylor, my brother's like, doesn't exist anymore, right? He's the one that has or had Asperger's, is now called the autism spectrum disorder. We used to call mental retardation, is now called an intellectual disability. People in the special education world, right? So having someone that was mentally retardation, we don't use that term anymore. We called it an ID, or an intellectual disability. Hoarding's been added. Again, I talked about the binge eating disorder versus just the bulimia. And something new that's been added is called DMDD, which is the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. It's kind of extreme tantrums. We'll put it in that in the separate lecture, but that has been added recently to talk about kids that have a very hard time regulating their mood, right? So we're talking about like extreme, tantrums from kids that are way too old to be having tantrums. Okay, so here's how the DSM-5 is broken up. Yes, you need to know these axes. There are 5 axes when we're looking at the DSM-5, and then based on the assessments and interviews and all this different data that comes, it might come from the parent, the self, the teachers, right? We're looking for sometimes friends, family, and they go along and they rate them on these 5 axes, right? So first of all, it's just, are the syndromes present? Like the clinical syndromes, right? So we might talk about like worrying too much. There's these very long questionnaires. I can show you a couple, but that say like, are these present? Yes or no. On the diagnosis of 2, right? So axis 2, they look at if there is a personality disorder or mental retardation, which is now intellectual disability. And the clinician may or might not select this. So it's like, we might have, for instance, my brother Jimmy has clinical syndrome of autism and on acid 2 and mental retardation. That was his diagnosis, right, when he was little. So if that's present or not, right, that's just something that's listed. Axis 3 looks for general medical conditions, so diabetes, hypertension, arthritis, look for those things present to see if for some reason those might be affecting those other, like 1 and 2. Axis 4 looks for environmental problems, housing, school, right, we're looking for are there other issues going on. And Axis 5 is looking at the global assessment. So on a scale of 1 to 100, how is it affecting the person's functioning in their everyday life, right? So if the person's still able to, might have all those syndromes, right? No mental retardation, no medical conditions, no environmental problems, and it's not affecting them on an everyday basis, they might not have, right? So they have those 0 on the 2 through 5, but they have the clinical syndrome present, right? So those are the 5 axes. You might need to know those. We can go over how we can memorize those and come up with some mnemonic devices. But here's going back to that environmental problems, right? So here's the biopsychosocial chart we talked about earlier. Those biology, we talked about genes, brain structure. Psychological influences, I'm going to talk about, poverty here in a second. But has there been stress, trauma? Is there some mood related to memories? And then social, cultural, like roles, expectations. What is considered normal in one society versus not normal in another? And then here, we did this one. I really should have done this before I started recording. Moved everything around. So talking about what is normal and not normal. Here we go. Okay. Rates of disorders, right? Looking at rates of disorders worldwide. I actually put a couple different things on here. So here is this right here. Here's a percentage, so the percentage of Americans. This is just America. I want you guys to know that this chart right here is just looking at American diagnosis. This is worldwide. I'll make that a little bit bigger in a second. So generalized anxiety disorder, 3%. Social phobias, right? This is, being around people, almost 7%. Specific objects, right? So look at all these. The highest one, the highest percentage that we see is in mood disorders, which is just like depression. And look at those a little bit separately. But you can look at like 1% of the population, schizophrenia, any mental disorder. So after this is looking at interviews, questionnaires, general population, about 26% of the American population has reported a psychological disorder in the past year. So looking at in the past year. Okay, this is worldwide. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I don't know if you guys can see it better. This is looking at worldwide. So the United States, we do have the largest percentage prevalence. I don't know why I'm laughing. I'm just saying that there's a lot of things that we'll talk about culturally that influences that. But on a positive side, it also is, what I want to say, more, we talk about it more, right? So it's not necessarily that people aren't affected by these things worldwide, but the people that are affected in the United States are seeking treatment, telling people, things like that. But look at the red. So serious mental disorders. So we talked about schizophrenia and depression. That's the red in each of these categories. So you see, especially around right here, we see about the same percentage of the population, right? The purple is any mental disorder, right? And that's the one that's really high in the Ukraine, France, Colombia, and the United States. Again, it could just be an awareness of those things. It could be environmental, but this is information from the World Health Organization on global. Some things you do need to know about rates as they change from country to country. This one is that worldwide, no matter what country you're talking about, we do see an increase of disorders below the poverty line. So people, children, adults that live below the poverty line in poverty see a higher incidence of mental disorders than those that are above the poverty line. Kids that live below the poverty line are more likely to express anger, ADHD, males, older males like more addiction, females more depression. But this is a little bit of the, egg and chicken thing, right? Is it the poverty that causes the mental disorder? Or is it the mental disorder that has an influence of that, whether or not that family lives under the poverty line, right? So people that are schizophrenic or PTSD, war veterans, they might have a hard time finding a job, right? And so therefore they live below the poverty line, or people that have addictive personalities. But we have seen, if you look at studies of children that started at under the poverty line and then went above it, so their families moved above, have seen a change in those behaviors, right? Again, is that because they have more access to, I'm just off on my tangent here, do they have more access to healthcare because they're making more and that's why it's diagnosed less, right? Chicken egg. Oh, and then the immigrant paradox, this is actually really interesting too. Immigrant paradoxes, this is where they interview people that have immigrated, so from whether it's from Mexico or the United Kingdom, from other countries. They came here for a better life, right? But the immigrants actually rate lower on the diagnoses. They report less of any of these things than we have in the United States. So why it's called the paradox is they're coming here for a better life, but the United States actually has a higher rate of disorders. Okay. All right. Lots of information there on disorders, DSM-5, how we classify them. And our next set of notes, I'll put this up too. These are the risk and protective factors. There are lots of risk things underneath here. These are things that are going to give you like the points that would add up to more likely being diagnosed with a mental disorder. And these are the things that are protective against being affected by a mental disorder. All right. But again, like some of these things, Mrs. Myers is just going off, like academic failure versus knowing how to read. Well, is it that you have, intellectual disability and therefore you have, can't read or low literacy or you don't do well in school? Or is it because you don't do well in school, right? So it's chicken egg. Okay. All right. Next lecture, we'll look at anxiety disorders. But that is it for now.